A peach stone from your kitchen counter can become a fruit-bearing tree in 3 years, and it will cost you nothing but a bit of patience. Every fruit tree you have ever bought from a garden center began its life exactly the way I am about to show you. I grew up in the Yorkshire Dales, in a stone farmhouse with a garden that fed 6 children through every season of the year. My grandfather kept an orchard that nobody had ever paid a penny for, because every tree in it had grown from a pit or a stone saved from the fruit bowl. He was not a scientist, and he did not read books on horticulture. He simply did what his own father had done, and what families across the English countryside did for generations before garden centers existed at all. I watched him plant peach stones in the autumn and dig up young trees the following spring, and I did not understand then how ordinary this once was. He kept a wooden tray by the back door, lined with damp sand, and every stone from every piece of fruit eaten in that house went into it before it was ever thrown on the fire or the compost heap. Nothing was wasted in that kitchen, not the fruit, not the peel, and certainly not the stone at its center. By the time I was old enough to help him, he had cherry trees older than my own father, all grown from stones saved the same way, in the same tray, by the same back door. I am sharing this now because very few people still know it, and because the knowledge very nearly slipped away in the space of 1 generation. Somewhere along the way, growing your own fruit trees stopped being something a family simply did, and became something you were told to buy instead. Garden centers sell grafted saplings for 30 pounds or more, and they will tell you that fruit from a pit does not grow true to the parent, which is sometimes correct and sometimes simply convenient for them to say. Nobody profits from you saving a peach stone after Sunday lunch and pressing it into the soil. There was no reason for anyone to teach this once nurseries had something to sell in its place, so the habit quietly faded from most households. A grafted sapling arrives with a guarantee of fruit within 2 or 3 years, and that guarantee is worth something to a busy household, but it also comes with a price tag attached to a piece of knowledge that used to be free. I do not say any of this with bitterness, only as a plain fact of how these things happen. A skill unused for 1 generation is very nearly a skill lost, and that is precisely what came close to happening here. What I am about to walk you through is not a theory I have read somewhere. This is how peach, plum, cherry, apricot, and almond trees were grown in cottage gardens across England for hundreds of years, long before anyone had heard the word nursery in this sense at all. It worked through lean years and rich years alike, and it still works exactly the same way today. The first step is choosing and preparing your pit, and this is where most people go wrong without realizing it. You cannot simply push a stone straight from the fruit bowl into a plant pot and expect it to grow. The stone must come from fruit that was fully ripe, soft, to the touch, and ideally left on a warm windowsill for 2 or 3 extra days after you bought it. Wash the pit clean of all fruit flesh, because any sugar left clinging to the shell will invite mold before the seed ever gets a chance to sprout. Let it dry on a windowsill for about a week, out of direct sun, until the outer shell feels properly hard. For peaches and apricots, that shell is thick and woody, and you may want to gently crack it with a nutcracker to expose the almond-shaped kernel inside, taking care not to crush the kernel itself. Cherry and plum stones are smaller and can usually be left whole. Almonds, being closest relatives to peaches in the rose family, are treated exactly the same way as a peach stone. Keep watching, because the second step is the one that decides whether your tree grows at all, and it is the step nearly everyone who fails has skipped. The second step is what Old English gardeners simply called wintering, and what is now known as cold stratification. Every one of these fruit trees grows in a climate with a proper cold season, and the seed inside that pit is built to expect months of winter chill before it will agree to sprout. Skip this step and you can wait a year with nothing happening at all. In Victorian kitchen gardens, gardeners packed stones into boxes of damp sand or moss, and buried those boxes in a cold frame or a shaded corner of the garden from November through to February. You can do the same today with a handful of slightly damp sand or compost in a sealed plastic bag, kept in the salad drawer of your refrigerator. Peach and apricot pits need roughly 10 to 12 weeks of this cold treatment, held at a temperature close to 4 degrees Celsius. Plum and cherry pits generally need 8 to 10 weeks the same way. Almonds want closer to 12 weeks, being a touch more stubborn than the rest. Check the bag every couple of weeks, and if you see any mold forming, simply rinse the pit. and start with fresh, damp sand. Some old gardeners preferred to skip the refrigerator entirely and simply bury a clay pot of stones directly in the ground, in a shaded corner against a north-facing wall, letting the natural winter cold do the same work outdoors. Either method achieves the same result because the pit does not know or care whether the cold came from a refrigerator or from an English winter, only that the cold arrived and lasted long enough. This waiting period feels like nothing is happening, and that is exactly the point. Underneath that hard shell, the embryo inside is slowly breaking its own dormancy, preparing itself to grow the moment warmth returns. Families in the 1940s working with wartime rationing and Dig for Victory allotments relied on this exact method to fill their gardens with fruit trees at a time when saplings from a nursery were simply not available to most households. They had no other choice, and the method did not fail them. But that is only the second part. And the third step is where most people who have got this far are genuinely surprised by how simple it is. The third step is planting and germination, and it asks very little of you beyond patience. Once your 10 to 12 weeks of cold treatment are finished, usually falling somewhere in late February or March, take the pits out of the refrigerator. Plant each one about 5 centimeters deep in a plant pot filled with ordinary peat-free compost, laid on its side rather than standing upright. Water it well, and place the pot somewhere bright, but not in direct scorching sun, such as a windowsill facing east or a cold greenhouse. Keep the compost lightly moist, never soaking wet, because a waterlogged pit will rot before it ever sprouts. Germination is not instant, and you should expect to wait anywhere from 3 to 8 weeks before you see the first shoot break the surface. Peach and almond pits are often the quickest to show themselves, sometimes within a month. Cherry and plum can take a little longer, and apricot is often the slowest of the 5. So do not lose faith if the pot appears empty for a full 6 or 7 weeks. Once the seedling has 2 or 3 sets of proper leaves and stands a few inches tall, it is ready to be moved into a larger pot, and by the following autumn, it can go into open ground if your garden allows it. Keep a close eye on the pot during those first weeks, because mice and squirrels have always had a fondness for a freshly planted stone, and more than one cottage gardener lost a whole tray overnight to a hungry visitor before learning to cover the pots with a sheet of fine wire mesh. A young seedling also needs protecting from strong midday sun in its first summer. So a spot with dappled shade in the hottest part of the afternoon will serve it far better than a bare, exposed windowsill. There is a fourth detail worth knowing, and it concerns what kind of fruit you can actually expect from a tree grown this way. A tree grown from a pit is not identical to its parent, because fruit trees do not breed entirely true from seed, the way a vegetable often does. What this means in practice is that your peach tree may produce fruit slightly different in size, sweetness, or ripening time compared to the fruit you took the stone from. In the great majority of cases, for peaches, plums, cherries, apricots, and almonds, the fruit is still perfectly good to eat and often surprisingly close to the parent. Cottage gardeners across England accepted this variation happily because a tree that cost nothing and fed a family for 30 years was never something to complain about. If you want a tree that produces fruit identical to a particular named variety, you would later graft a cutting from that variety onto your pit-grown rootstock, which is itself a traditional skill, though not one we need for today's purpose, for simply having a productive, healthy fruit tree in your own garden. Growing from the pit alone is more than enough, and it always was. There is a fifth point that matters greatly for anyone in a cooler part of England, Scotland, or similar climates, and that concerns hardiness. Plum and cherry trees grown from pits tend to be the hardiest of the 5, tolerating frost and poor soil with very little complaint, which is exactly why they were the most common trees found in old cottage gardens across the north of England. Peach and apricot prefer a more sheltered, sunnier spot, ideally against a south-facing wall, which is precisely why you so often see old brick walls in country gardens built specifically to hold the day's warmth for these trees overnight. Almond trees flower very early in the year and can lose their blossom to a late frost, so a position with some overhead shelter helps considerably. If you are trying this for the very first time and want the greatest chance of success, plum and cherry are the 2 most forgiving of the 5, tolerating small mistakes in watering or positioning far better than a peach or an apricot will. Once you have had success with those 2, moving on to peach, apricot, and almond becomes a great deal easier, because by then you will already understand the rhythm of cold, patience, and warmth that every one of these trees depends on. None of this is complicated once you know it, and none of it requires anything you cannot find in your own kitchen and garden shed. What strikes me most, looking back on all of this, is how much knowledge my grandfather's generation carried simply because they had to. They did not think of themselves as skilled or resourceful. They thought of themselves as ordinary people doing what their own parents had shown them. Somewhere in the last few decades, that quiet transfer of knowledge from one generation to the next began to break. Not because the knowledge stopped working, but because it stopped being necessary for daily survival and convenience took its place instead. I think of the allotment holders during the war years, tending fruit trees they had grown from stones because there was simply nothing else available to them. And I think of how little separates their situation from our own today, when household costs climb and a little self-reliance starts to feel valuable again. The method has not changed in all that time because a peach stone in 1943 needed exactly the same cold, the same patience, and the same damp sand as a peach stone does this year. That is, in a strange way, rather comforting to me. I do not think convenience is a bad thing in itself, but I do think something valuable was set aside without anyone truly deciding to set it aside, and I believe it is worth picking back up, especially now when growing your own food costs nothing but a little patience and a bit of saved fruit. Anyone reading this, regardless of where they live or how large their garden is, can save a stone from tonight's dinner and begin this same process by winter. If this has been useful to you, there are more methods where this one came from. I share a new one every day. The old ways are still here. You simply have to know where to look.